Now let's take a look at the question. Spot the incorrect statement. Option A, fishes have counter-current exchange of gases. Option B, mollusks use gills whereas earthworms use moist skin for respiration. Option C, frogs respire through skin and lungs. Option D, cockroaches have blood that helps primarily in gaseous transport. Now, if you noticed, all of the options are talking about different organisms and their respiratory structures. We have to find out which of the given statements is incorrect. So, in order to arrive at the correct answer, let us examine each statement in detail, starting with the first one. So, the first statement says fishes have countercurrent exchange of gases. Now, this is a true statement. Let me explain to you what countercurrent exchange means. So, when you split this countercurrent term, compound word, counter we know means opposite, right? And current means there's a flow or transport or something. So here in countercurrent exchange, we're talking about flow of fluids in opposite directions. The two fluids that we're talking about here are water and blood. Okay, so you know that fishes respire through their gills, right? In gills, gill lamellae are present, and these gill lamellae are highly vascularized. That means they have a big, good supply of blood vessels like capillaries. So when countercurrent exchange happens, what happens is the water will flow into the gills, through the gills in one direction, but the blood flowing in the blood capillaries of gill lamellae will flow in the opposite direction. And while this flow is happening in opposite directions, exchange of gases will take place. Okay, so that is why it is called counter current exchange, because flow of these two fluids are happening in the opposite direction. So in fishes, the oxygen transfer from water, remember fishes take in dissolved oxygen from water, to blood takes place via counter current exchange. Counter current exchange basically means the flow of water over the gills is in the opposite direction to that of flow of blood through the capillaries in the gill lamellae. What are capillaries? Capillaries are thin blood vessels. Okay, so the first statement is correct. So in the second statement, there was a mention of earthworms and mollusks. So in mollusca, which is organisms belonging to phylum Mollusca of animal kingdom, you can find feather-like gills, which are respiratory structures used for exchange of gases. So these feather-like gills can be found inside the mantle cavity of these organisms. One good example for a mollusk would be the snail. So that part of the statement is correct. Now let's look at earthworms. In the statement, it was given that earthworms use moist skin for respiration. So this also is correct. The outer surface or the skin of these earthworms, which belong to the phylum Annelida, it's always moist, okay? And exchange of gases can take place through the moist skin. The skin always needs to remain moist because it is only when it's moist can there be passage of dissolved oxygen into the bloodstream. So from the atmosphere, the moist skin will take up the oxygen, it gets dissolved in, and then it gets transferred into the bloodstream. It gets diffused into the bloodstream. Talking about the different respiratory structures used by frogs. Frogs can respire by three means. It can exchange gases and respire through the moist skin, very similar to earthworms, and that is known as cutaneous respiration. Another way in which frogs can respire is by their buccopharyngeal cavity. Frogs have a respiratory surface in their mouths that is known as the buccopharyngeal cavity, and over there exchange of gases can take place. Whenever frogs are completely submerged in water, they use cutaneous respiration. Whenever they are in rest, their predominant form of breathing is buccopharyngeal, through the buccopharyngeal cavity. Another means by which frogs can respire is by lungs. So that is known as pulmonary respiration. Frogs have nostrils through which air can be drawn into their lungs. Okay, so frogs also can breathe by taking in air through their nostrils and down into their lungs. Now let's talk about cockroach and the blood of cockroach. Cockroach is an insect that belongs to the phylum Arthropoda. They are primitive when you compare them with advanced organisms like us humans. So they do not have respiratory organs like lungs, okay? So the cockroach respiratory system, it does not have any lungs like we do. Instead, how they take in air is by having small openings present on their lateral sides that are known as spiracles. Here you can see a small opening present on the side, on the lateral side of cockroach. This is known as a spiracle. Through the spiracles, cockroaches will draw in air from the atmosphere. And they have colorless blood. If you've ever killed a cockroach, you will know that the blood of a cockroach is not red like our blood. Okay, so it has a colorless blood, and that is known as hemolymph. The reason the blood is colorless is because it does not have any respiratory pigment. The reason our blood is red is because we have a respiratory pigment known as hemoglobin that gives red color to the blood. And hemoglobin is involved in the transport of respiratory gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen. Since the blood of cockroach, the hemolymph, it lacks a respiratory pigment, it is colorless. Because there's no respiratory pigment, the blood is not involved in gaseous transport. Okay, so this statement was incorrect. It is given that cockroaches have blood that helps primarily in gaseous transport. It is incorrect because there's no pigment. They are not involved in transport of gases in cockroach. So with this, we've arrived at the correct answer. The correct answer to this question is option D. Now let's take a look at the question. What is the correct sequence of passage of air during inspiration? Option A, larynx to trachea to bronchiole to bronchi to alveoli. Option B, larynx to pharynx to trachea to bronchiole to bronchi to alveoli. Option C, pharynx to larynx to trachea to bronchi to alveoli. Option D, pharynx to trachea to bronchioles to bronchi to alveoli. Okay, so let me first explain to you the correct sequence in which air will move into our lungs during inspiration. What is inspiration? Inspiration is the process by which we draw air from the atmosphere into our lungs. So air enters our lungs through our nostrils, right? So first we have the nostrils through which air will enter the nasal cavity or the nasal chamber. From that, air enters the pharynx. Now pharynx is a portion which is common to both the digestive and the respiratory tracts. So the food that we swallow also enters the pharynx. The air that we breathe in through our nostrils also enters the pharynx. So there are chances for the food we consume to go down the respiratory tract instead of going down the digestive tract. Okay, so what happens is after the pharynx, there is a region in the respiratory tract known as the larynx. Now this larynx, opening of the larynx, there is a flap-like cartilaginous structure known as the epiglottis. Whenever we swallow food, the epiglottis closes the opening of the larynx. Therefore, the food during swallowing is forced down the digestive tract and does not enter the respiratory tract. Okay, so nostrils to nasal cavity to the pharynx to the larynx. The opening of the larynx is guarded by the epiglottis, and then from the larynx it goes down the trachea. Now trachea is what we call the windpipe. Trachea at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebra will give out two branches that are known as bronchi, primary bronchi. Both these bronchi will further branch to produce secondary and tertiary bronchi, and the tertiary bronchi will further branch to give you more thinner tubes that are known as bronchioles. The final tubes are known as terminal bronchioles. These terminal bronchioles open into sac-like structures that are known as alveoli. Okay, so here we have the nostril. Air enters through the nostrils, goes into the nasal chamber or the nasal cavity. Then we have the pharynx. So here is the larynx, and from the larynx it comes down the trachea. Here you can see how there are two branches. They are the primary bronchi. Their further branches are known as secondary, and even further there are tertiary bronchi. And then you have bronchioles, terminal bronchioles that open into the alveoli, which are the sac-like structures, and it is at the walls of the alveoli that exchange of gases will take place. Okay, so air enters the respiratory tract via the nostrils. It then travels through the nasal cavities and passes through the pharynx. It is then led into a second chamber called the larynx. In order to ensure that the food doesn't accidentally enter the larynx, the cartilaginous flap called the epiglottis covers the larynx while we swallow food. I already told you about that. Air then passes on to the trachea, which eventually divides into two bronchi, each leading to a lung. Okay, we saw that here, how each bronchi enters the lung, right? So the bronchi then branch into smaller bronchi, the terminal branches of which are known as bronchioles. The bronchioles, the terminal bronchioles, are surrounded by clusters of sac-like structures that are known as alveoli. So when you look at this, the correct statement or the correct option for the correct sequence of transport of air during inspiration would be option C. So from the pharynx to the larynx to the trachea to the bronchi to the alveoli. So what makes the first option incorrect? Bronchi should come before bronchioles. When you look at option B, pharynx comes before larynx. There itself there's a mistake. Again, when you look at option D, bronchi should be before bronchioles. So that is what makes the other statements or options incorrect. Okay, I hope you've understood. Here's the question. Select the correct statement. There are 4 statements provided in the question. Statement 1, thoracic chamber is an open chamber filled with air. Statement 2, thoracic chamber is built by dorsal ribs, ventral vertebral column, lower diaphragm, and a lateral sternum. Statement 3, any change in the thoracic cavity volume is not reflected in the lung cavity because of the anatomical setup of lungs in the thorax. Statement 4, humans cannot directly alter the pulmonary volume. Now let's look at the options. Option A, only statement 1 is correct. Option B, both statements 2 and 3 are correct. Option C, only statement 4 is correct. Option D, all are correct. Okay, so we can come back to the question and examine the statements, but before that, let me explain to you about how the thoracic chamber is. Okay, so the human respiratory system, it consists of lungs, and lungs are located in our thoracic cavity, right? So they are located in the thoracic chamber, and the thoracic chamber is an anatomically airtight chamber. In the first statement, it was given that it is an open chamber that is filled with air. That is an incorrect statement. So the thoracic chamber is an airtight chamber. So let us now try to understand what makes the thoracic chamber airtight. Okay, it is because the thoracic chamber dorsally is made up of the vertebral column. You know, the vertebral column is our backbone. It has many different bones that are present, lying or stacked one on top of another. So that is the vertebral column. Dorsal refers to our backside. Okay, so we have the backbone dorsally, the vertebral column, and the sternum. The sternum is known as the breastbone. So here is the sternum. So the sternum is present ventrally. Ventrally is our front side, and lateral means sides. Okay, laterally we have 12 pairs of ribs. Okay, so these 12 pairs of ribs, they are attached dorsally to our vertebral column and ventrally to the sternum. Okay, so some of them are attached to the sternum directly, some of them are attached indirectly, and some of them are not attached ventrally at all. Okay, but they are all attached to the vertebral column dorsally. That is what forms our rib cage. So as you can see here behind you have different vertebrae to which these ribs are attached, and in front they are attached to the sternum. Now at the bottom on the lower side we have this dome shaped. Here you can see it is colored in flesh color. So this is the diaphragm. Diaphragm is a muscular structure which is dome shaped. So the presence of all these structures in our thorax makes the anatomical setup of this airtight. Okay, so the anatomical setup of the thoracic cavity is such that whenever there's an increase in the volume of the thoracic cavity, then there will be an increase in the intrapulmonary volume as well. So if there's any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity, it will reflect in the volume of the lungs as well. Okay, so that is how the setup is, and it is very important because that is how breathing takes place. We alter the volume of the thoracic cavity, thereby alter the volume of our lungs, which is very essential for breathing in and breathing out. So that's because we cannot directly modify the volume of the lungs. Okay, so let's examine the statements again. Thoracic chamber is an open chamber. No, it is not. thoracic chamber is built by dorsal ribs. No, ribs are lateral. Ventral vertebral column is dorsal, so that also is incorrect. Lower diaphragm is correct. Lateral sternum is incorrect. Sternum is ventral. Okay, so this statement also is incorrect. Statement 3, any change in the thoracic cavity volume is not reflected in the lung cavity. No, it's incorrect. Any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity is reflected in the volume of our lungs. So last statement, humans cannot directly alter the pulmonary volume. Now this statement is correct because we cannot directly alter the pulmonary volume or the volume of our lungs. That is why we alter the volume of the thoracic cavity. If we increase the volume of the thoracic cavity, there will be a resultant increase in the volume of the lungs as well. Likewise, if you decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity, there will be a decrease in the intrapulmonary volume as well. Okay, so of the given statements, there's only one statement that is correct, which is the fourth one. So the correct answer to this question is option C, only statement 4 is correct. Here's the question. What is the pulmonary volume of air inhaled by a person under normal conditions after he forcefully exhales out? Okay, so what is the pulmonary volume of air inhaled by a person? Normal inhalation after forcible exhalation or expiration. Okay, so the options are TV only, TV plus ERV, TV plus IRV. Option D, TV, ERV, TV plus ERV plus IRV. So first let's understand what TV, ERV and IRV are. TV is short form for tidal volume. Tidal volume refers to the volume of air that we breathe in or breathe out during normal effortless breathing. Like right now while we're breathing, we're not putting conscious effort into it. We're not taking deep breaths and giving out deep breaths, right? So during normal effortless breathing, the volume of air that goes into and out of our lungs is considered to be tidal volume. And per breath, it is about 500 ml. So a person on average takes around 12 to 16 breaths per minute. So if you were to calculate the tidal volume per minute, it should be 6,000 to 8,000 ml. Okay, so that's the tidal volume. What is inspiratory reserve volume? Remember IRV. This was mentioned in one of the options. IRV refers to inspiratory reserve volume. Since it is saying inspiratory, it obviously has something to do with inspiration, right? So over and above the tidal volume, I just now told you that tidal volume is the volume of air that we breathe in and breathe out during normal effortless breathing. But the additional volume of air that we can take in by forcible inspiration is known as inspiratory reserve volume. Okay, so the additional volume of air that can be breathed in by forcible inspiration, and its value is about 2,500 to 3,000 ml. So by a deep breath we can take in this much volume of air. By effortless breathing it is this much, right? So over and above the tidal volume, the additional, remember this word, the additional volume of air that we can take in by forced inspiration is known as inspiratory reserve volume. Expiratory reserve volume is very similar. Expiratory reserve volume is abbreviated as ERV. It is the additional volume of air that a person can breathe out by forcible expiration. Okay, so tidal volume is the amount of air that we can breathe out during normal effortless expiration. But when we forcibly breathe out, then the additional volume of air that we're giving out is the expiratory reserve volume. It's about 1,000 to 1,100 ml. Okay, so in the question we were asked what is the volume of air, pulmonary volume of air that a person can take in by normal breathing after forcibly expiring. Okay, so what happens during forcible expiration? We would have given out tidal volume, that much amount of air, as well as expiratory reserve volume, right? So from our lungs, TV plus ERV, this much volume of air would have gone outside. So there is that much amount of vacuum that is created in our lungs. If a person exhales forcefully, both the tidal volume, that is TV, and the expiratory reserve volume is expelled out from the lungs. So that is the amount of vacuum created in the lungs. So when a person is normally inspiring after forcibly expiring, so the equal volume will be taken in. So when a person inhales normally without any effort, he inhales an amount of air that is equal to the amount of air that was expelled. Okay, so while forcible expiration, we would have given out TV plus ERV. By normal inspiration back, we will be taking back the same amount. Okay. So the correct answer to this question is TV plus ERV, which is option B. I now have a match the following type of question. Let's take a look at it. So under column 1, we have location of different structures involved in the exchange of respiratory gases. So there's alveoli, oxygenated blood and tissue. And in the second column, there's partial pressure of oxygen given in the unit millimeters of mercury. The values are 40, 104 and 95. We are required to match the partial pressure of oxygen correctly with its location. Okay, so before we look at the options, let's first try to understand how exchange of gases, be it oxygen or carbon dioxide, will happen in our body. Okay, so exchange of gases, be it carbon dioxide or oxygen, takes place by diffusion. Diffusion is a process by which movement of molecules will take place from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Okay, we've learnt about this. So here it is based on a pressure gradient. Molecules will move from a region where the pressure is greater to a region where the pressure is lesser. So let's consider oxygen, because that is what is the subject of this question. So oxygen we take in air, right? In the air that we inhale, oxygen is a part, right? Oxygen, 21% of the atmosphere is oxygen. So we inhale air, in that oxygen also will be present. The oxygen present in the alveoli, once the air reaches the lungs, it will enter the alveoli, which are sac-like structures present in our lungs. At the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen will be 104 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so surrounding the alveoli, we have blood capillaries. Alveoli, they are sacs that are highly vascularized. So around the alveoli, you can find many blood capillaries that are carrying blood. So the blood would have come to the lungs from the tissue. So it would be carrying carbon dioxide from the tissue. So the blood is said to be deoxygenated. And the deoxygenated blood's partial pressure of oxygen will be 40 millimeters of mercury. So when you look at the difference, there obviously is a gradient, right? Here it is higher, here it is lower. They are not equal on both sides. And as a rule, spontaneously, gases or air will move from a region where the pressure is higher to a region where the pressure is lower, along the pressure gradient. So oxygen will move from the alveoli into the deoxygenated blood. Now that oxygen has entered blood, it becomes oxygenated. In its oxygenated state, the partial pressure of oxygen is 95 millimeters of mercury. So after oxygen from the alveoli enters to blood, it becomes oxygenated, and the partial pressure of oxygen will increase to 95 millimeters of mercury. Now this oxygenated blood from the lungs is transported, it goes to the heart, and the heart pumps blood, and the oxygenated blood is transported to all parts of the body. All of our tissues get oxygenated blood. And at the tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen is very less, because the tissues take up oxygen, make use of it for cellular respiration, and start producing carbon dioxide. Okay, so when you compare the partial pressure of oxygen with the partial pressure of in the oxygenated blood to the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen is greater in the oxygenated blood compared to the tissues, due to which oxygen will move from the oxygenated blood. It will diffuse from blood into the tissues along the pressure gradient. Okay, so after oxygen is delivered to the tissues, the concentration of oxygen in the blood will decrease. Okay, so at the tissues, what is happening? Blood will deliver oxygen to the tissues and in turn pick up carbon dioxide, due to which again blood will become deoxygenated. Okay, so now as oxygen is picked up by the tissues from blood, its partial pressure will increase. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide will decrease in the tissues, because it is giving out carbon dioxide into the blood, and that's what makes blood deoxygenated. Now here's a very simple table that gives the values of partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide in different components. So this question is about oxygen, so I will focus on oxygen. Atmospheric air has 159 millimeters of mercury. That is the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. So it is more compared to the alveoli. So there is movement of oxygen from atmosphere to the alveoli, then to blood, from the blood to the tissues. Okay, so these values were what was asked in the table. So alveoli will have maximum of the given options. So 1 should be paired with 2. Oxygenated blood will have 95 mm of mercury, and tissue, at the tissues, it will be 40 millimeters of mercury. So the correct answer is 122331, which is option A.